There's a moment that shows up for almost everyone who has spent real time in a relationship with a narcissist. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or a big dramatic scene. It arrives quietly, with a very specific kind of tired clarity. It's the clarity of someone who has finally, after everything, run completely out of the fuel it takes to keep trying, keep explaining, keep absorbing, keep hoping that just one more conversation is going to be the one that finally shifts something. And in that moment, they do the thing they've thought about 100 times, come close to a dozen times, and always pulled back from at the last second. They go no contact, they stop answering, they quietly step out of the conversation, out of the dynamic, out of the constant low-level emergency of orbiting a narcissist's moods. They just go quiet. And then something happens that almost nobody warns them about ahead of time, something that turns out to be just as disorienting in its own way as anything that happened while they were still inside the relationship. The narcissist has expectations about what no contact means. Very specific, deeply rooted, completely unexamined expectations about what's supposed to happen once someone they were involved with stops responding, about what the silence is for, how long it's meant to last, and most importantly, about what role they get to play in ending it. And those expectations end up driving behavior throughout the no contact period that, if you don't see it coming, can undo everything you fought to build. Something that was never meant as an opening can suddenly start to look like one. The silence you worked so hard to create can start to feel, confusingly, like it's turning against you. So today, I want to walk through exactly what a narcissist expects when you cut contact. Not the version they say out loud, not the story they tell mutual friends to explain why you've gone silent, but the real, specific, psychologically driven expectations that quietly shape every move they make once you stop responding. This isn't just theory. Understanding these expectations is the difference between a no contact that actually holds and one that collapses. And when it collapses, it's usually not because of the narcissist's relentlessness. It's because of your own confusion about what their behavior during that silence actually means. Let's start with the foundation, the belief underneath every other expectation a narcissist carries about no contact, the assumption baked so deeply into their psychology that it doesn't even register to them as an assumption. To them, it just feels like fact. They believe the silence is temporary because they believe you need them. This isn't always a conscious thought, it's structural. It's built into the architecture of how they understand themselves in relation to everyone around them. The narcissist's grandiosity, that constructed sense of their own outsized importance that their entire psychological system exists to protect, comes with a very particular belief about what they mean to the people in their life. Somewhere below rational thought, they believe they are irreplaceable. They believe the intensity they brought, the validation, the high voltage attention of those early days, the specific chemistry of that dynamic is something you simply can't find anywhere else and can't function without for long. This isn't a conclusion they reached by weighing evidence. It's a psychological requirement of a self that cannot stand to be ordinary, cannot tolerate being replaceable, cannot sit with the possibility that the person who just went quiet is out there somewhere without them and doing fine, maybe even better than fine. Maybe in the quiet of a life no longer built around managing someone else's moods, starting to feel something the narcissist's presence never allowed. Peace. That's a possibility the narcissist system simply cannot hold. It gets rejected immediately, completely, automatically. And in its place, they install the expectation that restores their sense of significance. You'll come back because you can't manage without them. Because the silence is really just a statement, a way of making a point, a bid to be heard, rather than a genuine exit. Because in the narcissist's internal dictionary, no contact was never meant to be a period of healing or a chance to reclaim yourself. It's a tactic, a temporary withdrawal engineered to produce a result. And they're simply waiting for the temporary part to run its course. That's the first and most fundamental expectation, and everything else builds directly on top of it. The second expectation is the one that drives the most confusing behavior during no contact, the kind of behavior that most often breaks the silence of people who don't understand what they're actually watching. The narcissist expects that their suffering will bring you back. Here's the logic behind it, or really the felt sense behind it, because this operates well below the level of conscious reasoning. From the relationship, the narcissist knows you feel things deeply. They know their pain moves you in a way other people's pain might not. They know the particular texture of your empathy, the way you experience their distress almost as your own, has been one of the main things keeping you tethered to the dynamic in the first place. Every time they showed pain or struggled or displayed that specific vulnerability, narcissists tend to reveal exactly when they need something from you. You responded. You moved toward them. You offered comfort, care, the full weight of your extraordinary capacity for compassion. They expect that mechanism to still work, even across the silence. So in the early stretch of no contact, you'll often see messages that aren't aggressive or demanding, the kind you might have braced for and prepared to ignore, but sad ones, struggling ones, messages that hint at difficulty without ever quite naming it, a text that doesn't ask you to come back outright, but somehow manages to communicate that they aren't okay without you. A social media post you're likely to stumble across, whether consciously engineered or not, built to trigger the exact emotional response that has always reliably pulled you toward them. And here's what makes it so complicated. The sadness might be genuine. Narcissists really do get destabilized when their supply disappears. The loss of your attention and care produces something real in them, something that isn't purely performance. A distress that's part authentic, part strategic, and from the outside, those two parts are often impossible to tell apart. But whether the suffering is real, performed, or most likely both at once, it's being used with the expectation that you'll respond the way you always have, with care, with movement toward them, with the breaking of a silence that your compassion is being counted on to break. And if you're not completely clear-eyed about what that suffering is doing in this moment, that doesn't mean you need to go cold toward it. It just means you need to feel it without acting on it. Let the compassion be real without letting it become a lever. Care about their pain without taking responsibility for it all over again. The third expectation shows up in the middle stretch of no contact, once the early messages haven't produced the reaction they were counting on. At this point, the narcissist starts to believe they can simply wait you out. That time, working on you without their direct input, will eventually accomplish what their messages couldn't. That the silence which they've reframed internally as your temporary protest rather than your actual exit will wear you down in very specific ways. They expect loneliness to creep in. They expect nostalgia for the good moments to resurface. They expect the self-doubt that shows up in the absence of their constant input, and they're counting on all of it to do the work they can't do directly anymore. They expect you to miss them in a way that starts to feel indistinguishable from need. They expect the early weeks and months of silence to slowly erode your certainty, your resolve, the exact clarity that made walking away feel necessary and right in the first place. They expect that without them constantly present in your life, without the relationship's steady supply of intensity, crisis, and that particular kind of aliveness toxic dynamics manufacture, your world will start to feel flat, muted, like something's missing, and they're waiting for that flatness to push you back into contact. Not always patiently either. Narcissists aren't naturally patient people, but they operate here with the confidence of someone who genuinely believes time is on their side, that your silence is borrowed, that the longer it stretches on, the more you'll realize what you're missing, and the more inevitable your return becomes in their mind. This expectation explains a lot of the behavior that trips people up during no contact, especially the stretches where the narcissist seems to go quiet themselves, seems to back off, seems to have accepted the situation. People often read this as genuine acceptance, and strangely, it can feel just as unsettling as the messages did. There's a pull to reach out just to confirm the narcissist is okay, or to close things properly, or simply because the behavior you'd expect from someone who cares hasn't shown up, and its absence somehow feels more disorienting than its presence would have. But what's actually happening in those quiet stretches isn't acceptance, it's waiting. Strategic, instinctive, often both at once. The narcissist has recalibrated after their first attempts failed and shifted into a longer game, trusting time itself and your own psychology to accomplish what direct messages couldn't. Don't mistake that quiet for resolution. It isn't resolution. It's patience being used as a strategy. The fourth expectation is the one that reveals the most about how the narcissist actually understood the relationship. and what they believed their role in it was. The narcissist expects that eventually you'll want acknowledgement from them. That somewhere underneath the silence, you're still holding out hope that they'll finally see what they did, that they'll admit it, that they'll give you the understanding, the accountability, the recognition of your experience that you spent the entire relationship trying to get and never fully received. On some level, they believe that unfinished business is exactly what will eventually bring you back. That the wish to be seen, to have the person who hurt you confirm the hurt was real, that you were right, that what happened actually happened the way you experienced it, is strong enough to override your decision to stay silent. And honestly, they're not entirely wrong about the wish itself. A lot of people who go no contact do still carry that want, the desire to be acknowledged specifically by the person who spent so long denying their reality. Not because the acknowledgement would actually change anything on a practical level, but because there's something deeply human in wanting the person who wronged us to know it, to have it witnessed, to have our own experience confirmed by the very source of the harm. The narcissist can't actually deliver this, not genuinely, not in any way that would truly satisfy that need, but they know the want exists, and they know that simply holding out the possibility of it without ever actually delivering it is one of the most effective ways to draw someone back into contact. Watch for this pattern in their messages, the ones that hint they've been doing a lot of reflecting. That suggests they understand things now they didn't before. That imply, without quite saying it outright, some kind of reckoning taking place, a new and improved version of them now available, one with fresh insight to offer, one who has finally arrived at the understanding you spent the whole relationship trying to get from them. It's bait, very specifically crafted bait, whether it's coming from conscious manipulation or just the narcissist's instinctive read on what you're longing for, designed to produce the one reaction that breaks no contact more reliably than almost anything else: curiosity, the urge to find out if this time is actually different. It isn't different. The acknowledgement being implied is never going to be delivered. What actually gets delivered, if contact is reestablished, is simply re-entry into the same dynamic, except now they'll know the bait works. Now they'll know that all it takes to pull you back is a performance of insight, a performance that can run indefinitely without ever needing to become the real thing. The fifth expectation is the quietest one of all. It doesn't necessarily produce obvious behavior on the narcissist's end, but it shapes everything else underneath the surface. The narcissist expects that you're thinking about them constantly, that whatever else this silence is, it's mainly organized around them, that it's a message about them, a reaction to them, evidence of just how much power they still hold over you, which, even in its negative form, still counts as supply. Even your absence, if it's a pained and preoccupied absence, still feeds the story of their own significance. What they don't expect is that somewhere in that silence, you've started thinking about yourself instead, that you've started reconnecting with who you were before the relationship, that the flat, muted quality they expected the silence to produce has quietly turned into something entirely different, something with a different name and a completely different feeling: space, room to breathe. The particular quality of air in a life that's no longer organized around monitoring someone else's emotional weather. They don't expect you to be okay. And the fact that you're not perfectly okay, not without grief, not without the complicated tangle of feelings that always shows up at the end of something significant, but genuinely, increasingly, surprisingly okay, is the one outcome their entire model never accounted for. Because in the narcissist's picture of you, the picture built from watching you inside the relationship, you're someone who needs them, someone organized around them, someone who can't sustain themselves for long without the intensity, the drama, and the particular electric charge the dynamic used to provide. They don't know anything about the person you're slowly becoming in that silence, the one who is remembering piece by piece who they were before all of this happened, the one discovering in the quiet sources of self that the relationship buried but never actually destroyed. They're expecting someone to come running back. What's actually being built in that silence, in that space, in the kind of healing that only distance from the dynamic can produce, is someone who isn't coming back at all. And with every expectation they're holding and every strategy they're running to pull you back in, the narcissist never sees that coming until it's already happened. So we've walked through 5 specific expectations so far. The belief that you need them and will inevitably return. The strategic use of their own suffering to move you. The patient waiting game that mistakes the quiet of your healing for the erosion of your resolve. The implied promise of acknowledgement engineered to spark exactly the kind of curiosity that breaks a silence. And finally, the assumption that the entire no contact period revolves around them, that even your absence is somehow a statement about how important they are. 5 expectations, and every single one of them is wrong. All 5 are built on a model of you that used to be accurate inside the relationship and grows less accurate with every single day you spend outside of it. Now let's talk about what happens when those expectations start to fail, when the narcissist's internal timeline runs out and the contact they were counting on never arrives, when the sadness didn't work and the waiting didn't erode your resolve and the implied promise of acknowledgement didn't spark any curiosity you were willing to act on, when they finally look at the silence and realize for the first time with something close to real alarm that it might not be temporary after all. This is where the 6th expectation shows up. And it's the most dangerous one we've covered so far. Not because it's the most manipulative, although it's a genuinely sophisticated move, but because it targets the single most specific and most vulnerable part of the psychology of someone healing from a relationship with a narcissist. The narcissist expects that your conscience will bring you back. Here's what that means in practice. In the absence of your contact, the narcissist will start building and spreading a story. Not always loudly, not always through channels you can see directly, but with the steady consistency of someone who understands that a narrative, once it's planted in enough places, starts to take on a life of its own. In this story, the no contact isn't your healing. It isn't your boundary. It isn't the necessary self-protective decision of someone who gave everything and got harm in return. In this version, the silence is cruelty. It's abandonment. It's you, someone who always took pride in being fair, in not being the kind of person who treats people badly, in holding on to your integrity even when things got hard, choosing to be unkind to someone who cared about you, someone who's struggling without you, someone who can't understand what they possibly did to deserve this kind of silence. That story makes its way to mutual friends, who carry fragments of it back to you, or it surfaces in social media posts that never name you directly, but that you recognize instantly through the grapevine of the shared life you used to have. And it doesn't land as an accusation you can push back against. It lands as a question, a seed of doubt. The exact uncomfortable question the narcissist knew would be hardest for you to sit with. Am I actually the one being cruel here? Your conscience, which is real and which is honestly one of the very things about you that made you a target in the first place, takes that question seriously. You're not the kind of person who brushes off the possibility that you might be causing harm. You don't have the narcissist's talent for locating every bit of wrongdoing outside yourself and holding that position indefinitely, no matter what evidence says otherwise. So you sit with the question, you examine it. In the honest, quiet hours, you wonder whether this silence that feels like survival to you might actually look like something far less defensible from the outside. And that's the trap. Not because the question itself is illegitimate. Some honest self-examination is always healthy. But because in this particular context, the question has been engineered. The doubt has been manufactured on purpose. Your conscience, the thing being appealed to here, is being used not to spark real ethical reflection, but simply to produce contact. And the narcissist knows that your conscience, once convinced you might be causing harm, will override almost everything else. It will override your clarity. It will override your resolve. It will override everything you know about what that relationship actually cost you. Because for you, causing someone else harm has always felt worse than absorbing harm yourself. So don't let a manufactured conscience override a genuine one. The silence isn't cruelty. It's honestly one of the most honest things you've ever done inside this entire dynamic. It's the first response that doesn't twist itself into whatever shape someone else needs it to be. It's you finally telling the truth about what you need, using the only language that's actually safe with someone who weaponizes every other form of communication available. That isn't abandonment. That's integrity. Even when, especially when, it's being framed as something else entirely. Now let's talk about what the narcissist doesn't expect, because this is where everything turns. They don't expect that no contact would show you exactly who you are without them. Because what actually happens in that silence, the part their model of you had absolutely no room for, is that you start to recalibrate. Your nervous system, which spent months or years locked in the low-grade emergency of that relationship, slowly starts remembering what a baseline even feels like. The hypervigilance that was necessary inside the dynamic, the constant scanning for mood and tone, the endless reading of subtle signals that told you what kind of day it was about to be, starts to quiet down, not instantly, not without the strange disorientation of a nervous system built around threat suddenly having no threat left to organize around, but gradually. And then at some point that's different for every person, something shifts. The quiet that was supposed to feel empty starts to feel like something else entirely. The absence that was supposed to wear you down starts to restore you instead. The space the relationship never allowed you, room to think your own thoughts, feel your own feelings, want things simply because you want them and not because they serve someone else's needs, starts to fill back in. Not with the narcissist's absence, with your own presence. You come back to yourself. Not the self you were before any of this happened, because that person was genuinely changed by what they went through and honestly can't be fully recovered and probably shouldn't be, but a self that's continuous with who you were before, one that recognizes your own thoughts as actually yours, one that knows what you like and what you don't, what you need out of an ordinary day, and which people in your life make you feel like yourself rather than like a carefully managed version of yourself. The narcissist never saw this coming. Their whole model had you diminishing in the silence, becoming less sure of yourself, less resolved, less able to sustain without the constant supply the dynamic provided. And what's actually happening is the exact opposite. You're becoming more yourself, more certain, more capable, not despite the silence, but because of it, of knowing what you actually want your life to look like. And the version of you that emerges from this silence isn't someone who's going back. Not because of raw willpower, not because of resolve you have to white knuckle under pressure every single day, but because the person coming back to themselves inside that quiet can feel clearly and specifically in their own body the difference between how they feel now and how they felt inside that relationship. And that felt difference carries more weight than any argument, any strategy, any amount of determined decision-making ever could. You don't go back because you've remembered what it actually feels like to breathe. And now, the image this whole conversation has been building toward. Picture the ocean at low tide. That specific moment when the water has pulled back further than usual, further than the people who walk that beach every single day have ever seen it go. The sand that's normally hidden underwater is suddenly exposed. Strange, ridged, full of things that have never once been seen in daylight, shells that were buried, rocks that were always covered, small living things that built their entire existence in the dark of deep water, now unexpectedly out in the open air. People who don't understand how tides work might look at this scene and feel something like alarm. The water is gone. Something's wrong. Something that was always there has vanished, and that absence feels like loss, feels like exposure, feels like the world has shifted in some way that can't quite be trusted. But people who understand tides know something different. They know the pulling back isn't the water leaving for good. It's the water gathering itself. The further the tide retreats, the more it's collecting, the more it's building. And the more powerfully the return, when it finally comes, will reshape the shoreline in ways the ordinary daily tide never could. The exposure of what was hidden underneath isn't a loss, it's a revelation, a rare chance to actually see what was always there, what the daily covering of water had simply made invisible, to finally name it and understand the shore in a way ordinary observation never allowed. You are that tide pulling back. The no contact isn't you disappearing. It's you gathering. Pulling back from the shore the relationship used to occupy, and in that pulling back, discovering the actual depth of what you are, the things that were always there underneath the daily churn of that dynamic, the self that was never lost, only ever covered, only ever made invisible by something that constantly needed to take up all the available space. The narcissist is standing on the shore, watching the water retreat, expecting it to stop, expecting it to come rushing back the way it always has, in the ordinary daily rhythm they've come to predict and depend on, and, most of all, control. What they don't know anything about is the depth you're quietly gathering in that pulling back. They don't know that whatever eventually returns, if you return to your own life, your own self, your own full and uncompromised existence, will not be the tide they were sitting there waiting for. It's going to be something they've genuinely never seen before, something that doesn't need their shore to know exactly where it belongs, something found entirely in the depth of its own retreat, something that belongs completely and only to itself. The water comes back, but not to where it used to be. It comes back to where it was always headed. And the shore, the narcissist standing on it, waiting with every one of their expectations for a tide that was supposed to return the way it always had, looks up and finds something they never predicted. Something vast, something quiet, something completely, finally, irrevocably its own, arriving on its own terms, belonging to no shore, home, at last, in its own depth.